I feel like I'm on 2 time zones, yours as well. I was in Tbilisi yesterday and just back in Washington today. So I feel like I can hang with both sides of those who are participating today. I also serve as the co-chair of the Friends of Ukraine Democracy and Civil Society Task Force, along with my colleague Orest, who's right next to me, who many of you know. And I want to welcome all of you here in Washington and also in Brussels, in Kiev, and also those who are joining by live stream. And I know that we have people who are also weighing in, watching from both in Canada and across Europe that are interested in what we're doing here today and at this launch today. And what we're doing today is launching the Transatlantic Task Force on Elections and Civil Society in Ukraine. And I want to recognize, again, as I said, many of those who've pushed to make this happen in Kiev, Washington, and Brussels, and elsewhere. And again, welcome all those who are participating virtually as well. The task force was established by the Friends of Ukraine Network Democracy and Civil Society Task Force, and working together, Olena, with you in the Reanimation Package of Reforms. And I think for all of you here today, one of the things that we really wanted to do is to institutionalize the engagement of civil society in Ukraine with U.S. Policymakers, opinion makers, think tanks, civil society organizations, those that are focused on Ukraine and have focused on Ukraine's transatlantic integration and democracy. And one of the gaps that we saw that existed in forming this effort was this gap of communication between Kiev and Washington, Kiev and Brussels, and looking at what's happening on the ground in real time. And of course, for Ukraine, this is a particularly important upcoming year in which there'll be 2 elections, a presidential election in March, and then also an election that will take place in October. And so our focus here at first was really to make sure that civil society in Ukraine, and I think this is a challenge for civil society globally, is how do you communicate to and communicate clearly to key policymakers and opinion makers and partners in key capitals. And from our end here in Washington too, one of the things that we saw as a gap too is that U.S. policymakers and others that are making decisions about U.S. policy in the region, and I think this also goes for Brussels as well, often don't really have a clear picture of what's happening on the ground. And this goes for in Washington, for Congress, but also the administration. And I think with what's taking place in Ukraine and this commitment of both Washington and Brussels, obviously led by civil society on the ground in Ukraine and the Ukrainian government, with all of this, with the interests of the United States and others, and with the upcoming elections and challenges on the ground, we really felt like we needed a new platform to communicate and to better understand on both sides, both sides of the Atlantic, but also with Ukraine. And this is going to be an impactful year for Ukraine, but it also could challenge the trajectory of U.S. policy in the region. So we're really interested, obviously, to establish this conversation with our partners, have more regular communication, which we'll do. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And hopefully, the importance of this is to benefit also civil society in Ukraine, which has really taken the lead over many years, but also since the Maidan, at moving Ukraine in the right direction. And another impetus, obviously, for this conversation was the attacks on civil society in Ukraine, which are of great concern. Others may go more deeply into that, or the lack of movement on anti-corruption efforts that many believe is the linchpin to Ukraine's efforts to become a member eventually of the EU and NATO. So there's a lot to discuss, and at one point we'll obviously turn it over to Kiev and also to Brussels, because on their end, I recognize that there are so many important civil society organizations, as there are organizations and leadership here in Washington that are participating in Kiev we might not get to everybody today. And each one of these organizations in their own right is incredibly important part of the conversations for many of us in the room here too, our partners that we work with. So we're really looking forward to engaging with them as well. And lastly, just like two additional points I just want to make, and I'm going to turn it over to Orest for scene setting. One, this effort is also about strengthening U.S.-Ukraine relations. Bottom line, because we view it as a priority to support Ukraine, and key part of Ukraine's success in the future is civil society, and focusing on how do you strengthen, consistently support civil society over an extended period in a country like Ukraine. So keeping Ukraine on its Euro-Atlantic track is important. I know Orest and others will go into this. We recognize as a group collectively that there are many challenges, both internal and external, that are actually shaping what's happening in Ukraine, as it is shaping U.S. policymakers or policymakers in Brussels as well, or whether it be in Berlin or Ottawa or elsewhere, that really is impacting what we do. And of course, I will only quote what National Security Advisor Bolton said last week when he told Russia to get out of Crimea and Donbass. I agree with that sentiment as well. So we're here also as supporters and friends of Ukraine, and Olena and others who've been working daily on this and sort of fighting the good fight on a number of challenging issues. This is about inclusion. It's about openness and transparency and engagement, about information sharing, and we're really excited to set this up and really deeply appreciate the participation of everyone here in Washington, Kiev, Brussels, and sort of across the spectrum. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over to Orest, my co-chair, also in his own right, one of the leading thinkers on U.S.-Ukraine relations in Washington and has been for the last several decades. And Orest, I'm going to hand it over to you. And then what we'll do is we'll send it over to Kiev. And but I also just want to recognize the World Ukrainian Congress in Brussels for setting up operations there and joining us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. I want to join Jonathan in welcoming everybody and thanking you all for being here, and GMF for hosting this, what amounts to a tri-city event. I just want to mention one thing, that the Friends of Ukraine Network, including our task force, is an initiative with foundation. Let me make a few points, really amplifying. You gave a very good scene setter, but I may amplify just a little bit. First of all, there's been a long history of American international engagement and interest in Ukrainian elections, positive engagement, that is not the Russian kind, and a recognition of these elections' importance. And one manifestation of that, as Jonathan has outlined, is our newly created task force. There's been strong U.S. government executive branch interest and involvement, state, USAID, but also from Congress for many decades. Resolutions, statements, hearings, participation in election missions, and whatnot. Also, of course, strong engagement with U.S. NGOs, and even more present here today, IRI, NDI, IFES, NED, as well as the Ukrainian American community and the Ukrainian diaspora in general, World Congress of Ukrainians being the umbrella group there. All have been involved with Ukraine elections and including fielding observation missions. Obviously, all of us are interested in tracking developments that will affect the outcome of these elections, which will profoundly, as Jonathan indicated, impact Ukraine's future trajectory at a pivotal time in the history of Ukraine. Well, the changes that have taken place the last 4 or 5 years continue. Important implications here, not only for Ukraine, but for the international community. But we also need to focus on the conduct of the elections. U.S. and international efforts for decades have been geared towards encouraging free, fair, open, and transparent elections that meet international democratic OSCE standards. And the US and EU All EU countries plus the US are members of the 57-nation OSCE, have worked with this organization, which is the lead international organization with respect to elections in Ukraine and the region, including their large and authoritative election observation missions. So the assessment of the OSCE and international community, including IRI, NDI, and others, with respect to these elections matters. And the most recent Ukrainian elections have been assessed relatively positively by the OSCE. But we need to do what we can to help Ukraine ensure that democratic standards continue to be met. This obviously has implications for Ukraine's commitment to democracy and rule of law, and this really matters. Let me just flag a few issues that will need, I think, watching and addressing, and it's by no means a comprehensive list, and then we'll look forward to hearing from our Kyiv speakers give their expertise and perspectives on this. One will be what's going to happen with the reforms over the next year. There have been real changes, we all acknowledge that, but obviously there's a lot more that needs to be done, especially in areas such as judicial reform and combating the scourge of corruption, including strengthening anti-corruption institutions. This has been laggy, I would argue, to put it diplomatically. Then there's electoral reform. It's been a year since a new electoral code was introduced in the Rada. There are thousands of amendments. There are important suggested changes. One important reform, I think, to watch for the Rada election, this obviously doesn't apply to the presidential elections, is whether we're going to see a change from the current mixed 50-50 system to a fully proportional open party system. Another key issue is the pre-election environment and campaign. The campaign formally starts in 2 months, but quite frankly, it's already begun. It's already in full swing. And here you have issues of media coverage, especially given media's reliance on oligarchs, or some of the medias, I should say, not all of them. Access of candidates and parties, the role of money, and more mundane but essential things like electoral administration, election administration. And in terms of concerns, I think we're not just talking about the usual kind of mudslinging, compromat, or populism, but also the problem, as Jonathan indicated, of physical attacks on civil society, especially anti-corruption activists and journalists, or efforts to obstruct their work. We've seen well more than 50 attacks since the beginning of the year, according to recent Human Rights Watch and Freedom House and Amnesty International report. This is very disconcerting. It needs to be taken seriously. You know, Ukrainian authorities at all levels need to see civil society as an ally and not as an adversary. And it's incumbent for all of us, all of Ukraine's friends, to monitor and encourage the exercise of civil and political rights in advance of these elections. And finally, although again, this is not comprehensive, but then countering Russia's malign election interference, which will be considerable, whether it be via malicious cyber attacks on Ukraine's election infrastructure. This has happened in the past. Let's not forget it happened in May 2014 during the presidential elections. Ultimately, it wasn't successful, thankfully. Or whether disinformation provoke conflicts or exacerbate already existing differences. This is not unique to Ukraine, as we know from our own experience lately. And by the way, Ukraine has a lot to teach us here. All I'll do to that point is just commend, in terms of countering disinformation, I'll commend to your attention yesterday's page 1 Washington Post article called "In Ukraine, a Warning of Russia's Election Assault." It's really worth reading. Also, there's the question of Russia's role and influence on some Ukrainian individual politicians and parties. So all of these are part and parcel of Moscow's attempts to destabilize Ukraine, which I think will only intensify following the recent granting, for all practical purposes, of Ukrainian Orthodox Church out of September. So we all have a lot to pay attention to in the coming months. And with that, let me turn it back over to Jonathan.
Orest, thank you, and I think I share your sentiments on all the issues that you outlined, and you didn't even raise some of the other security issues that are challenging Ukraine, but all of the above are areas that need focus attention. Before we turn to Kiev, I want to just, Marina, can I just turn it over to you in Brussels just to do a quick hello, and I think you might want to just let us know who's in the room.
Yeah, good day, Kiev. Once again, good day, Washington. We are very pleased to be here with you today and to participate in this launching event. We definitely hope that this is just the beginning, and that in the following months there will be consecutive events, consecutive gatherings that we will also be able to host, provided that our equipment doesn't let us down. So here in Brussels, we have gathered experts and civil society activists, representatives of the leading think tanks, as well as representatives of the Crimean Tatar community, and we very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on the upcoming elections.
Well, in this conversation, and I can't stress how important that this effort be a true transatlantic project. Brussels and Washington are both critically important to what's happening in Ukraine's future, but also officials in both Brussels and in the U.S. are weighing in heavily in this pre-election period on issues such as the anti-corruption court. Some people argue that they'd like to hear an even louder voice from the U.S. on support for civil society in Ukraine. I think that probably is the same in interest of hearing more from voices in Brussels and Europe on these issues. And of course, the outcome of the election is certainly going to and including upcoming EU parliamentary elections, could challenge how Brussels views Ukraine and Ukraine's future, as well even our own elections, which are happening next week, our midterm elections. So if I can, I'm going to turn it right over now to Brussels, but before I do, to Kiev, but I just wanted to we have several really important speakers, Olena Prokopenko, who's with the Reanimation Package of Reforms, Mykhailo Zhernakov, who's a Ukrainian lawyer and co-founder and director of DEJURE Foundation. We also have Denis, who's Kovryzhenko, who currently serves as a senior legal advisor at the Ukrainian IFES office. And Olena, I'm going to turn it over to you, but I just really want to thank you deeply for your efforts to pull this together in the middle of all the other things that you have going on in Kiev, and for all of your partners there who are willing to spend time with us and provide us your thoughts, advice. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Kiev, right now.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Dear colleagues in Kiev and Washington and Brussels, thank you very much for joining us today for this launch event, for the launch of the Transatlantic Task Force on Elections and Civil Society in Ukraine. As many of you know, since 2014, the Ukrainian civil society has been broadly involved in the reform process in Ukraine through the development of the progressive legislation in the most fundamental areas, through participation in the selection of the government officials, including judges, through the support of the establishment of the anti-corruption and other state institutions. So it's probably safe to say that since the Maidan, civil society in Ukraine has become the strongest or one of the strongest influencers on the policy process and the key non-government driver of the reforms in this country. However, we realize that without political and technical support of the United States, of the European Union, of Canada, of other international partners, most of Ukraine's reform achievements would not be possible. Every time when international partners make a public statement in support of a certain reform development, or every time when Western macrofinancial assistance package to Ukraine is tied to specific reform benchmarks, this greatly supports and helps our advocacy efforts, which we are very grateful for. That is why we're interested in keeping our international partners as informed as possible. And we have been looking for the ways to make our engagement with the Western partners more regular, more institutionalized. So the suggestion of the German Marshall Fund to create this task force turned out really timely. We believe that for the Ukrainian civil society organizations, this task force is a great opportunity to voice their policy priorities that require international support directly to the US and EU policymakers and opinion makers, while for the US and EU audiences, we believe this is a great opportunity to have direct access to the expertise of Ukraine's most reputable think tanks and to the verified, unified position of the civil society of Ukraine on most critical issues that Ukraine is likely to face in this pre-election period. As to the agenda of the task force, in the next 12 to 18 months, we plan to cover the progress of Ukraine's reforms, from anti-corruption and judicial reforms to electoral reform, of course, to energy independence, to defense, cybersecurity, economic development, and of course, safety for the civil society. We will also regularly review public opinion on various political issues. We will look at the risks impacting the conduct of the elections, and we will also review the policy of the United States and the European Union towards Ukraine prior to the elections, during the elections, and after the electoral cycles. Why now? Well, the pre-election period in Ukraine, as colleagues in Washington rightly mentioned, has been in full swing for a few months now, and up to 40% of Ukrainians have not decided who they will vote for. So there's absolutely no clarity as to what the political leadership of the country will look like in less than a year. Meanwhile, both elections will have a direct impact probably on Ukraine's relations with the West, and thus we believe that both election cycles should be closely monitored. Moreover, the challenges that Ukraine may face in countering disinformation efforts, in countering undue interferences in its elections, may be important cases for the Western partners to analyze in the light of the upcoming elections in the EU and in the US this year and in the upcoming 2 years. So we are really excited about this task force, and we're grateful to all of you for your interest and for your support of this initiative. As to the current and most immediate policy priorities require international attention, I would name the following. First of all, it's of course, again, safety for the civil society. As many of you may know, the last few months have been marked with the record number of attacks on the civil society activists and on the journalists, and they have not been properly investigated. So we call on the government, on the law enforcement authorities, and the highest leadership of the country to react to that and to ensure proper investigation. Another top priority for us, and we believe for Ukraine in general, is of course national security and defense. As a country at war, fighting the Russian aggression in the east, Ukraine should continue prioritizing this reform. In particular, by the end of this year, we believe that the draft law on the state security service should be finalized and brought to the parliament for consideration, as prescribed by the law on the national security, which was adopted earlier this year in June. Also, ensuring fair electoral rules is among Ukraine's major tasks for this pre-election period, and my colleague Denis will expand on that in more details in just a few minutes. Economic development should remain one of the key areas to focus on, both for the national audiences and international. The parliament should further deregulate the economy and eliminate any administrative pressure, which is still very real, administrative pressure on business to attract investments, to enable the growth of the investments in Ukraine. And of course, anti-corruption reform, anti-corruption efforts remain on top of our agenda. And after the long-awaited adoption of the law on the High Anti-Corruption Court of Ukraine, the court is now in the process of the establishment, and not to go into details on every stage of the selection and where we are now, I would just say that civil society advocates for the transparency of each of the stages of the selection, and on the other side, we believe, on the other hand, we believe that the institutions that have already been established, particularly the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, should be protected from any attempts to undermine their operation while the High Anti-Corruption Court is being established. So these are the key areas where we would very much appreciate your attention, your assistance, and we would be happy to provide you with more information on this. But like I said in the beginning, these 5 issues that I just underlined are the immediate priorities, but not the comprehensive list of the issues and topics we will cover in the next 12 to 18 months. And with this, I would like to pass the floor to my colleague Mykhailo Zhernakov, who is working to establish the rule of law in Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you, Olena. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm extremely honored to be here and to be talking to everybody, both here in Kyiv and in Brussels and in the US. Of course, for me, this is especially a very important and a dear moment, because I've just a couple of months ago came back from the US, from James Denton Transatlantic Fellows Program, where also we discussed in great detail how we can strengthen transatlantic cooperation. I'm really happy that we're launching this right now, and I do think it is great future, and we can do many things here. I'm also happy that so many people mentioned today the importance of the judicial reform and establishing the rule of law in Ukraine, because it is not only a priority for the DEJURE Foundation, which is pretty much all we do, but also a priority for Reanimation Package of Reforms, because we strongly believe without the rule of law, without the strong judicial institutions, without the fair justice, other reforms are not possible. Economic growth is not possible. Direct investment is not possible. Successful fight against corruption is not possible. Unfortunately, I also have to admit, I have to agree with Orest that it was not a great success. All the efforts, despite all the efforts put in, that we changed the constitution regarding the judiciary, that we adopted a number of laws, that we launched a number of procedures, there's very few things that have actually changed. And we created a new Supreme Court from scratch, where unfortunately we have around 80% of all judges that doesn't function like a new institution we hoped it to be. We have zero. The government just declared that they finished the second stage of the judicial reform, so to say, the reform of the appellate courts, where we have 0 new judges. They were just transferred from the old courts to the new courts without any competition whatsoever. The pressure on judges remains. The political influence on the judiciary remains. There are some, yes, there are some steps forward. There are some untrustworthy judges removed from their positions, but these are, unfortunately, this is not by far not what we hoped for, and it did not yet lead to a desired outcome, which is strong and independent judiciary. So I do think that we have to rethink many things together. I do think that the international involvement here is key, because it is also because we have adopted a number of standards that we, of course, one of the reasons is political, the notorious political will, so to say, that the big part of the government, or the majority of the government, did not really want to change the judiciary. They still want to keep it as a tool for the elections, for the other purposes. But also there is an institutional problem that we unfortunately placed the implementation of the reform into the arms of the same old judges that we would like to change. With all due respect to Council of Europe and the ambassador of Council of Europe that we have here in our audience today, who I respect a lot, as well as the institution that he represents. We adopted this Council of Europe standard of majority of judges elected by judges in the judicial governance bodies too soon. It is not a bad standard, but it's not the right time to adopt it here in Ukraine, because it's a clear conflict of interest, keeping the old judges, making them basically remove themselves from the positions. It doesn't work. Also, if we turn to the polls, we see that the Ukrainian society trusts, for example, representatives of the civil society organizations 6 times as much as it trusts their own judiciary when it comes to renewal of the judges. It trusts the international community, experts from foreign countries, 4 times as it trusts the judges from judicial governance bodies when it comes to creating the judicial institutions such as the Anti-Corruption Court. So we actually have to rethink many things here, and also on the bright side, the Venice Commission, the body of the Council of Europe, also recognized that and stated that first of all, that Ukrainian judiciary is in a very specific situation, is in fact in a bad shape, and it needs renewal. Second, and there should be specific measures towards that. Second, that when it comes to creation of the new institutions, such as the Anti-Corruption Court, the crucial role should be given to the Council of International Experts in that regard. And this is good, and we already have made steps towards that. We're days away from creation of the Council of the International Experts for the selection of the anti-corruption judges. We'll see how that will work. I'm very optimistic about this. We still have to change the procedures because there's a lot of issues there when it comes to the bylaws of the High Qualification Commission of Judges. But we will have an institution that will have its word there, an international institution. Second, or maybe first, we have created the Public Integrity Council, a institution that is created 100% of the representatives of the civil society, which I also have an honor to be a part of, and that also proved that the judicial selection and the judicial cleansing, so to say, or renewal can be made more effectively. And I think we have to continue going that way. And of course, the international, we have to rethink our judicial governance bodies, make them strong institutions, the direct involvement of the civil society and the international community into judicial selections, because obviously we see no other choice, and we don't see other parts of our society or any society for that matter that our people trust. And again, international role here is key. I absolutely agree that without the international involvement in the reform process, what we have achieved would not be possible. Of course, we do recognize the achievements in fight against corruption, many other things, but 99% of them probably would not be possible without the help of the international organizations and international partners of Ukraine, both technical and, of course, political. And, of course, I would call for stronger cooperation in order to reinforce that, to help Ukraine build its strong institutions, because the strong institutions are, in the end of the day, those that keep the countries together. Also, the US and the countries of the EU in what is now a political uncertainty, to say the least. But this is the state institutions that keep the country together and that keep them going. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy that we're launching this cooperation, and I'm really looking forward to continuing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mykhailo. And with this, I would like to give the floor to Denis Kovryzhenko from IFES Ukraine. Since the topic of the upcoming elections is in the center of this initiative, I would like Denis to tell us more as to where we stand on the progress of the electoral reform and what are the realistic next steps for the next few months.
Thank you, Olena. Hello, everybody. I will not talk too much about the importance of the elections, because we will elect both president and the parliament, and many voters, as rightly was mentioned before, have not decided yet for whom to vote. We also have the circumstances of external aggression and some internal issues, including the role of money in Ukrainian politics, which affects the overall quality of Ukrainian politicians when they are elected. In 2014, major political forces that established the majority in the parliament signed to the coalition agreement, whereby they committed themselves to comprehensive election law reform, the harmonization of the laws governing various elections by adopting the new election code, and to electoral system change. Previously, our parallel system, which is used in the parliamentary elections, whereby half of the parliament is elected based on the first past the post and the remaining part is elected based on the closed list party system, was strongly criticized by both civil society and experts, partially because FPTP component of the system opened the door to manipulation, abuse of state resources, and vote buying, and therefore everybody believed in 2014 when the coalition agreement was signed that this system would be changed. However, what we have now, the election code was adopted in the first reading in November last year, and before the second reading, MPs submitted almost 4,400 amendments to this code. So de facto, this process, the process of processing these amendments is quite lengthy, and so far MPs managed to consider only 1/3 of all the amendments. And frankly saying, in the last, in the view of the international standards, particularly in the view of Venice Commission recommendations, whereby no major changes to the election laws should be made in less than 1 year before the elections, I do not personally believe that the process of processing these amendments and subsequently adoption of the election code will be successful, given that almost 2/3 of the key amendments have yet to be processed. So this is the part which relates to the electoral legal framework. We have many other issues, including the issue of internally displaced persons. Roughly we have 1.6 million of them. In addition to that, we have the issue of labor migrants, and both IDPs and labor migrants face difficulties in exercising their electoral rights. In particular, they cannot vote in local elections in places other than they registered in particular in the places where they actually reside. Also, in the parliamentary election, they receive just one ballot paper to vote for the party list, but not for the single mandate district candidate. And therefore, this can hardly be viewed as consistent with the international standards which provide for equal voting rights. The second issue is cybersecurity in the elections. In 2014, we had a series of repeated hacker attacks on the CEC website and internal systems, which used to transfer the election results from the lower level to the top. And this challenge should be also addressed well in advance before the next elections. Currently, CEC, the Central Election Commission, is working closely on that, but this process is also complicated given some procurement issues and some other issues related to procurement of the relevant equipment, training of staff, and so on and so forth. Luckily, we succeeded to appoint new Central Election Commission. Previously, most of the members of the Central Election Commissions were serving on the expired terms since 2014, and finally the Parliament replaced them. So we have the complete relaunch of the Central Election Commission, and we believe that new Commission will be more transparent and accountable and eager to introduce important reforms and needed reforms. This includes strengthened transparency in CEC operations, accountability through submitting annual reports, and many other things which were presented previously by the civil society and discussed with the Central Election Commission. When it comes to other issues, we also need to strengthen the accessibility of the elections to various vulnerable groups, to include for instance, people with disabilities who currently are isolated from the election process, as well as to strengthen the level of women representation in the parliament, which is one of the lowest in the region. So we have only roughly 12% of women in Ukrainian legislature, while many other European states almost achieved, or in many cases tend to achieve, the 30% recommended representation in the parliament. When we look at the OECD recommendations from I think 2007, 2000 and later electoral cycles, 2007, 2012, 2014, we will see that most of them have yet to be implemented. This includes harmonization, dealing with excessive funding of the electoral campaigns, procedures for vote counting, tabulation, and some other technical issues which Ukrainian parliament failed to properly address. So when we talk about priorities for election reform, we first need, what we need first is just to wait until it is clear whether the election code is processed or not, and whether it has any chance to be adopted by the parliament. If not, then we need to quickly fix the key issues well in advance of the at least parliamentary elections. The first one is, the first issue to tackle is harmonization of the election laws. They were adopted in different times and are not harmonized, which complicates overall electoral management. And therefore, at least if we do not have the election code, the amendments are needed just to streamline the procedures laid down in different legislation. We also need to enfranchise IDPs. This issue was raised by IDPs themselves and is supported by civil society, but for political reasons, many political forces represented in the current parliament seem to be reluctant to give the IDPs the right to vote in the places of actual residence, as well as to give them the right to vote for single mandate district candidates. Well, the system, as I said before, poses a number of risks and prone to political corruption, abuse of administrative resources, and some other issues. One of the key reasons why this system does not perform well is the issue of impunity. We have hundreds of criminal cases launched during each electoral cycle by the Ministry of Interior, but most of them do not survive courts. And in fact, we have just few those who actually serve criminal punishments for the electoral fraud and some other offenses. And the overall atmosphere of impunity is one of the reasons why many things which are criticized by OSCE or DEJURE, to include again vote buying and other issues, are so widely spread and can be actually expected in the next elections. The role of money in politics needs to be more thoroughly regulated, and currently the electoral campaigns are excessively funded, and many politicians strongly depend on their donors. In 2015, we had comprehensive political finance reform, but this reform should be strengthened, and in particular consideration should be given to restricting the or putting limitations on excessive funding of electoral campaigns by restricting political advertising, paid political advertising, or at least setting the maximum amount of money the parties can spend on the election campaigns. And as I said before, the issue of ensuring the rights of various vulnerable groups of people still remains pronounced, and it can be effectively addressed before the election because it's not politicized, and the parliament can succeed in fixing these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. And now we're back to Washington for questions.
To Kiev for a second. Did you want to mention the other organizations that are present and are participating? Because I really want to make sure, because there's just an extraordinary group of people who are working with you and working on this effort that are contributing in many different ways.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. Yeah, this initiative is joined by a number of the most reputable Ukrainian NGOs and think tanks, and I would like to specifically mention the participation and the support of the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, the Center for Democracy and the Rule of Law, the Center for Policy and Legal Reform, Opora Civil Network, Democracy Initiatives Foundation, DEJURE Foundation, represented by Mykhailo Zhernakov, Center for Economic Strategy, Anti-Corruption Action Center, Center UA, which we also have the executive director of Inna Barzilo here in this room, and Transparency International Ukraine. So we are grateful for the support and for the participation of these leading NGOs in this initiative, and in the next rounds, the next of which would probably be in December, hopefully. We want them to be in our panel, and we want to hear from them on the key priorities of the reforms that they're focusing on. Primarily, the next round, I think, will be focused on the anti-corruption reform, electoral reform, and others which I mentioned before. Thank you.
All the organizations, think tanks that are participating, and I want to thank all of our speakers too, because I think, Olena, when you listed, I think, a really wide range of areas that you're focused on, that others in Kiev prioritize, that are also important for us to better understand. And I also appreciate the response on rule of law and what is lacking right now and the true challenges that exist. And this goes also for the electoral related issues that were also just raised, from electoral laws to IDPs, to what's happening with the CEC, or lack of fulfillment of ODA recommendations from previous elections. I think what you outlined is that a lot of the serious challenges that need to be addressed, but it also strikes me that how important it is that you mentioned the sort of the international engagement and international partners and role. And because regardless of the direction even of these elections, the efforts need to continue beyond electoral results, whether in March or parliamentary elections. And so I think it's really important for us to hear what these priorities are. What I wanted to do right now is just open the floor here in Washington to take a few questions, and we'll just bundle them together. And if you can identify yourself, the organization you're with, that would be great. And then what we'll do is we'll turn it over to Brussels for a couple of questions as well. We would ask them to do the same. But we'll start first with Washington, then we'll go back to Kiev to answer, then we'll go back to Brussels for questions, and then we'll go back to Kiev again. So, and also I appreciate everybody with your patience in terms of technology, but we think this is the best way to have a regular conversation, is to bring all of us together via video and in a more timely fashion. So if you can just raise your hands, and we'll, and I see two right here, and I don't know if we need to also, I think we have a microphone. And just please identify yourself as well. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Katie Fox from the National Democratic Institute, and I want to thank you very much for an extremely informative and concise presentation. You really crystallized the issues for us, and also for Orest and Jonathan. This is a fantastic initiative. So I have two questions. The first is to Mykhailo in regard to the judicial reform. Is there the international community's intervention on the High Anti-Corruption Court worked in part because the ask was distilled down to something very, very specific. We must have the international community must have a decisive role in selecting judges. Is there an equivalent ask for making judicial reform successful at other levels? If it is the international community, what's the ask for the international role? That's my first question. My second question is, Olena, can you untangle a little bit for us what's happened to Nabu, what needs to be done to protect it? So many concerns. Thank you.
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the second question?
The second question is, you talked about protecting anti-corruption institutions such as NABU. Yeah. What exactly is the status? What are they threatened by now, and what do we need to do to protect them? Mm-hmm. There have been many developments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Katie. Thank you for your questions.
If we could hold on 1 second, we're just going to bundle questions together, and then we'll come back to Kiev.
Hi, I'm Joshua Solomon. I'm from the International Republic Institute, and this works out perfectly because my question is to Denise. So my understanding is that you can't change the electoral code less than a year before the elections. And a lot of the issues that you've raised are legislative issues. My question is, how can we address those issues, assuming that the electoral code isn't going to be changed, and that the system that we have is today is the system that we're going to have a year from now. How do we address without changing legislation, how do we address the issues that you've raised?
Any other questions? Okay, why don't we go to those two questions back to you, Kiev?
Should we take them in the order of, yeah, probably we should. If I understood this correctly, so the question was about the international involvement in the establishment of the anti-corruption court and whether there are other implications for the judicial governance, or what? Can you please repeat that part, if I may?
The question is, what can the international community ask for in regard to making reforms of the other courts that you mentioned? Not the high anti-corruption court. They were successful with a very clear ask about the high anti-corruption court. So what is the ask for the other courts that can be sort of simple and clear?
Great question, thank you. I think the one point that we should all concentrate on is the reform of the judicial governance bodies, because both the Council of International Experts and the Public Integrity Council, the Council of International Experts that's comprised of the internationals whom the Ukrainian society trusts, and the Public Integrity Council that's 100% representatives of civil society, which also the public trusts. These are, let's say, they have very limited roles. The international experts have more role in the selection of the anti-corruption court, but still not a decisive one. What needs to be done, and I think we'll learn a lot from this experience of the establishment of the anti-corruption court, and we already have learned a lot with the selection of the Supreme Court and the other courts, what doesn't work, because the Integrity Council did not have enough decisive power, is that it should be strengthened, and basically the judicial governance body, which is the High Qualification Commission of Judges of Ukraine, which is now 2/3 judges elected by judges or otherwise, but are all judges whom we entrust the renewal of the judiciary. So basically we make turkeys vote for Christmas or Thanksgiving, if you may. And this should be changed, and we have to have the representatives of the parts of the society that the Ukrainians trust. So the civil society, the non-judges, lawyers, the representatives of the international community may be directly involved in this judicial governance body. The models can be different, but the bodies responsible for the selection have to be changed. Thank you. In order to actually to establish not only the high anti-corruption court but the rest of the courts, in order to make the rest of the reform effective. Thank you.
Yeah, I would go on to the second question. Well, National Anti-Corruption Bureau has been proving itself as an independent institution that has been going after the so-called untouchable elites, and we have over 160 cases that NABU successfully investigated and turned them to the courts. But unfortunately, the cases are now stalled in the unreformed regular courts rather than in the High Anti-Corruption Court, which we wait to be established. So because of the independence of the NABU from the political influences as of now, it is under constant attacks from all kinds of stakeholders, including on the highest political level and from the General Prosecutor's Office as well. Some of you may remember December 2017 when NABU was under attack from a number of fronts at the same time, and only with the consolidated effort of the civil society and the international community through public statements, through publications in the most influential international media, these attacks have been opposed and stopped. So the first thing that has to be done to protect NABU from further attacks and from further interferences in its activity is, first of all, to eliminate any influence any political influence on the audit of the NABU. As you may know, the 3 auditors have been appointed, but the audit has to be done transparently in order for the NABU not to remain under those attacks, at least on this front. It's also important to prevent the sabotage of NABU's activity through the leadership of the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, including the leaks of information on the investigations of the NABU. On the legislative side, it's crucial to finally give the NABU the powers to wiretap, which it doesn't have for now, although the civil society has been, and international community has been calling for this for, I think, over 2 years now. Also, the parliament should adopt the law on the National Anti-Corruption Bureau as soon as possible, and the draft is there waiting for the adoption. Another thing is that, as again most of you may know, the National Agency for Corruption Prevention has many times discredited itself in the recent months, and we have heard about the possibility of the transfer of the functions to verify electronic declarations of officials from National Agency of Corruption Prevention to the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. We support this initiative, and this would be another step to strengthen NABU, to broaden its powers, and to deal with the issue on the side of the National Agency for Corruption Prevention, which we don't see the potential to resolve in the next few months. Thank you. And, we are now back to Washington for more questions.
Great.
Yeah. There was one question regarding the election code. So my brief answer is that Venice Commission just do not recommend to substantially change the key elements of the elections, to include election districting provisions, electoral system, and some other issues. If we do not manage to adopt the election code, which is very likely, then the parliament can proceed with just fixing the major issues in the 3 election laws which govern the parliamentary, presidential, and local elections. All these changes are now reflected in a specific draft which aim to introduce amendments to these 3 laws. Basically, we have the law aimed to enfranchise ADPs. It was prepared by civil society and is ready for consideration pending in the parliament. So it's up to the parliament, and the parliament needs to do its job to adopt this law quickly. Similarly, we have other pieces of legislation which are waiting for consideration in the legislature. In particular, on accessibility of the elections, we have the draft law which aims to introduce women quota for the parliamentary and local elections, and some others. So despite the fact that international standards do not recommend to substantially or significantly change the electoral legislation, technical changes are still possible, and many things can be introduced in upcoming months, especially given that presidential election law does not need currently a substantial review, and the key issues are related only to the parliamentary and local election law. We have respectively local elections in 2020 and parliamentary elections in a year in October 2019. So basically we have time to fix all this, to fix all the problems that were raised by the international community, including OSCE, DEJURE, Venice Commission, and others, because mostly they are technical issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Jonathan?
Great. I just had 2 quick questions. One related to the cases where attacks on civil society and the response of the government, and I wanted to just get from you maybe an update on where things stand in terms of those investigations and the response that you're getting from the government. Is it something that you feel is adequate or needs additional attention? Because I think that will also send a strong message, particularly pre-election, to see that type of response. And then lastly, I just wanted to ask you about this. Maybe this is more of a 40,000-foot question about. There's obviously growing concern here about Russian disinformation in Ukraine, and also efforts to scuttle the elections or play a role in elections. And I guess the question would be, what are you seeing right now? What are you and your colleagues seeing, and what efforts are being made to address that challenge? And I guess the third part to that question is it more of a challenge, the challenge is more internal, meaning disinformation internally, that could be harmful, or is it more the external challenge, or maybe both? But maybe you could speak to those issues, because obviously it features prominently here in the US when you talk about upcoming elections, as the role of Russia. Back to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As to the issue of the attacks on the civil society, only this year, over 55 attacks on the civil society activists and journalists have been documented. Over 400 threats to the civil society activists and journalists have been made. In the recent month, we have not seen any progress in the investigation of the most resonant, of the most high profile of these cases. And although various actors may stand behind those attacks, and we are not in the position to make claims as to who those could be, but the fact that there is no public reaction of the highest political leadership, including the leadership of the Ministry of Interior, to these facts, and there's again no progress of investigation, is very symptomatic as to the lack of the political will to deal with those cases. And it also sends a clear signal and green lights the continuation of those attacks and aggravation of this tendency. If like 1 year ago we could see that those attacks were mainly happening in the regions, now we can see that some of them are happening already in Kiev, and the nature of those attacks, the type of those attacks are becoming more and more dangerous, and some of them end in murders, basically. So civil society has made a number of statements on this. We have held street action under the presidential administration, and we were joined by a number of other organizations asking for some public response, for some public assessment of this tendency, of this aggravating tendency. We have also informed our international partners on this on many occasions, and from what we can see, there's little we can do as a civil society at this moment to prevent this tendency. So we call on the international community to keep monitoring those cases, and of course it might be difficult to have the updated information on those cases every time it's needed, but we're here to provide you with that information, and we work closely with the human rights organizations who have more information on that. So we're here to provide you with the facts and figures on what's happening, and we ask you to raise those issues of attacks in every communication you have with the Ukrainian government authorities, from the top political leadership of the country to the law enforcement authorities as well.
If I may just briefly add on, I think it's more of a Denise's role to comment on the election issues, but we clearly as a coalition see this as a security issue as well, for the same reasons that Denise mentioned earlier, that the single constituency format or system can be used to infiltrate Russian agents basically into our parliament, presenting them as the independent candidates. Also, as for the just briefly, not exactly my field of expertise, but just to give you my thought, I think we're lacking a state policy regarding a viable state policy regarding the combating misinformation. There are some efforts to that, but of course there are NGOs initiatives that are basically dismantling or explaining the fakes and the misinformation that is spreading. But I don't think that is enough to combat and to successfully oppose that. Maybe colleagues will add something on that.
Yes, I'm also expert on elections, so it's more about media regulation, I would say. But basically, the issue of disinformation could only be addressed through voter awareness campaigns, whereby authorities or civil society explain what disinformation is and expose all these facts to the broad public. When it comes to regulation, the issue itself cannot be effectively regulated. Personally, I do not support any significant restrictive measures which may violate the European Convention of Human Rights, but there are some attempts in the Parliament to regulate this information issue. Another aspect of the problem is the role of social networks and new media in the elections. They are not regulated at all, and currently there is no consensus among the experts of how to approach the problem and whether this segment should be regulated, and if yes, how it should be done. So indeed, I would agree that disinformation still remains an issue, but it can the problem cannot be effectively addressed solely through the changes to legislation. When it comes to cybersecurity, as I thought before, currently there is a process, ongoing process of dealing with that, mainly through procurement of the equipment, which will ensure appropriate protection of the system of the management of the election results administered by the CEC. But there are some problems in this respect, but hopefully they will be fixed before the presidential elections to be held in 2019.
Just to add very quickly, I think a balance should be struck between, as much as I agree with that we have to protect and not violate human rights, but we're in this very specific situation right now in the moment, and as well as we shouldn't, because we don't trust our judges, we shouldn't place all the implementation of the reform in the majority of judges elected by judges, which is a fine standard otherwise. I think there's also has to be some specificity as to how we regulate the freedom of media, because again, we have channels, we have media that are not, they do not act as media, they act as something that is completely different and completely opposite. So definitely the answer should be found, the response should be effective, but of course a fine line should be found there.
I would just briefly add a few words on the pressure on the civil society. Physical pressure is just one layer of the general tendency. Other layers or stages of the pressure are on the legislative level, which is a declaration obligation for the civil society activists, and media defamation campaigns, which are made possible through the key TV channels in Ukraine. As to the e-declaration obligation for the civil society activists, it is still in force, and we as a civil society have initiated an appeal to the Constitutional Court in July this year through the Ombudsman and through 65 MPs. Our case, or the case we have initiated, has finally the proceeding has finally started. However, the proceeding will be conducted in the written form, which decreases our possibility to voice our position on this issue. So in order for the e-declaration obligation for the civil society to be cancelled, which is unconstitutional to remain in place, more international pressure is necessary, more international involvement is necessary. So we would be happy to cooperate with you on this issue as we did before. Back to Washington now.
I think we have one more question, but I want to just thank you for pointing out the e-declaration challenge. I mean, there has been international push to urge the government to, to address that issue, and it's a critically stubborn issue, and I think I agree with you about more international pressure. But it's been there, but it hasn't worked. We have one more question here, and then we're going to turn it over to Brussels.
My name is Gina Lentine, and I'm from Freedom House. And Olena and Jonathan, it's very timely that you bring up restrictive legislation, because that was my question. I wanted to ask you all, so Freedom House has been monitoring very closely the rising attacks on civil society and civic activists in Ukraine, and we've been also actively involved in monitoring draft legislation that's been coming out that threatens civic space, namely draft laws number 6674, 6675, and also 8501. I was curious what you think the possibility is about whether or not this legislation could continue to move forward and be enacted into law, particularly ahead of or around the upcoming parliamentary elections next year.
Well, I would say that this issue is important to voice and to keep it in the public debate and in the communications with the Ukrainian government. However, the prospects of the e-declaration obligation to be cancelled before the next parliamentary elections, at least, is very low, we believe, because the whole idea and the whole initiative to introduce e-declaration for civil society activists equal to the e-declaration requirements for the public officials was a clear revenge, we believe, on this part of the parliament, of the president, after the declaration requirement for officials was advocated by the civil society in 2016. We assess the chances of this e-declaration obligation to be cancelled as very low, like I said, but we believe it should be kept in the debate, and we are grateful for the support of the Freedom House to the coalition in support of the civil society, which was established just recently after the tendency of attacks on the civil society became to aggravate. And we, like I said, work closely with the human rights organizations that are cooperating with Freedom House on these issues to be more informed on how we can involve the international community in dealing with those issues. Back to Washington now. Sorry, we don't seem to hear you. Can we hear us?
Yes. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Okay. We're going to send it over to Marina in Brussels.
Yeah, thank you so much. Does anybody have a question? If you could just come up here because I have built a microphone. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you everyone very much for the overview that you provided. My name is Anna Levite, and I'm here from the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies. We talked about Russian meddling in the elections. So looking at the candidates they are running for presidential elections right now, what would be the biggest win for Russia? Because as far as I know, Boyko is the only one who is openly pro-Russian, or are there any other candidates that would be, let's say, beneficial to Putin? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Then I have a question actually related to the first one that was asked. While this question was asked about the success of the judicial reforms, in view of the electoral cycle that is upcoming, I would like to ask what is the bare minimum of reforms required in the judicial sphere? So much back to Washington.
To Kiev to answer those questions.
Dennis, would you like to take the first question?
So yeah, basically it's a political assessment, so I wouldn't like to comment on this. Of course, we will have some political parties and political figures supported by, let's say, Russians, but we cannot, we do not have enough evidence to connect this or that politician to specifically to Russia. Some of the political parties just support pro-European Union, some pro-Russian. So we have diverse landscape, and there are some political leaders which are supported by, or not actually supported, but can be viewed as pro-Russian politicians. But again, it's like personal assessment, so I would prefer not to comment on that.
If I may, I can comment on that. before I answer the judicial question, we're also a non-partisan organization, so we can't really make preferences, but definitely there's more than one openly pro-Russian candidate here. I think that we know their names. Then there are other candidates who are not openly pro-Russian, but who can collude with Russia as soon, or already colluding with Russia, or will be willing to cooperate more closely, so to say the least, if they are elected. Some of them are very high in the polls right now. So, and we're now only talking about the presidential elections, but it's more than that. It's much more than that. I think the much bigger threat is not the president himself or herself, but rather the parliamentary elections. And again, I have to reiterate here how much it depends on the possible change of the electoral system and how current system is very vulnerable to be infiltrated, for the parliament to be infiltrated by the Russian agents running as independent candidates in the single districts, other than running in the party list that has to be or that has to declare that they in their program that they are more or less pro-Russian. So, and there's many more dimensions to that, of course, but again, I personally see that the threat of the Russian intervention or influence in the elections is not in the presidential elections, but also very much in the parliamentary.
We have Deputy Head of Democratic Initiatives Foundation, Alexei Haran here, so I would
yes,
ask you to comment on this.
Hello, Democratic Initiatives Foundation is a member of this coalition. I'm also professor of comparative politics from Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and I would like to add something to this question. I fully agree with Mykhailo Zhernakov that the main accent Russia is doing in these elections is not so on presidential elections, but on parliamentary campaign. But where I disagree with Mykhailo is actually the influence of potential electoral reform on these issues. Look, we should understand that good ideas doesn't necessarily lead to do not necessarily lead to good results. You know, it's a paradox, but this is a reality of politics. I am in favor of open party slate system since 1998, and definitely we all agree that this system in principle is better than the present mixed system. But in reality, according to the polls, to all the sociological polls, including those that we are doing, the future Ukrainian parliament may appear to be much more populist and fragmented. And if we use purely proportional system, it would mean that the share of the populist forces in the future parliament would actually be more than the present one. While mixed system, and we all understand disadvantages of this system, nevertheless, it would make the representation of different political forces more even. This is paradox, but we should take it into account. Again, in principle, all of us are in favor of this open party slates, but in reality, this may lead to increase of the share of the populist forces in the parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, and if I may continue on the judicial reform issues, I have to again say that we strongly believe, as both as DEJURE and as RPR, as well as many other partners, that judicial governance should be changed. This is #1 issue. We had very good ideas, we had very good, we had just good legislative changes or constitutional changes. The implementation is something that we lost. Our current judicial governance bodies are, they formally correspond to the standards of Council of Europe, but they remain to be heavily politically influenced. They let through a lot of candidates or judges who are obviously corrupt, obviously untrustworthy, who do not correspond to the basic requirements for the judge. So we see that the major issue is in the judicial governance, and this is a #1 issue. And in order to have good judicial governance, we have to rethink the judicial governance bodies and to include representatives of the civil society and others whom Ukrainian society trusts, other than the judges elected by judges. Judges have to be represented by right now they don't have to play this as a role. Thank you.
Back to you, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you for responding. And I just wanted to highlight on Russia and sort of candidates and connections being influenced. I think this is a particularly important issue. I'm not asking that you who are sitting up at the table in Kiev necessarily have to weigh in equally on this, but I do think one of the major concerns here in Washington that we hear is that you may end up with a president that is much more willing or more deeply connected to Russia than you may have today. And I think that will have an impact on how U.S. policymakers, and I'm certain it will have an impact in Brussels as well. And so I think shedding light on who's engaged with whom, I am sure that's of deep interest to the Ukrainian public, but it's also of incredibly deep interest here in Washington. And I don't have to explain why that is a big issue, but you can imagine what U.S. policymakers would think on the day after an election if you wind up with somebody who somehow colluded or was working with Moscow. It would have a dramatic impact on U.S. policymakers. So I think that's important. One of the things that we wanted to do too was, obviously this is an interactive engagement, is also in Kiev, is to give you the opportunity if there's any questions that you have, because we have a number of think tank experts and organizations here that might be able to address some questions as well. So I want to see if there's any questions that you have on your end of us, and not to put you on the spot, but if you do, we would welcome hearing those questions from Kiev. Orest, did you want to weigh in? Okay. All right. Back to you in Kiev.
Do we have any questions here?
Just a very short comment. I absolutely agree that the presidential elections is of utmost importance. That goes without saying. I just wanted to make sure. There are organizations that have this analysis, and there are, I think this information is out there. If you just Google it, of course it's very available very easily. Who's the candidate who's openly pro-Russian, who are the candidates who have a tendency to work with Russia and so on. And of course it is very important for everybody to understand who these people are. First of all, for the Ukrainian public, and there are organizations that are aimed at explaining that to everybody. It's just not, probably not us here, but also just another thought. One person, of course, they will have a dramatic influence on Ukraine's policy, on the international and internal, but one person, however pro-Russian, they will not be able to return or to reverse 180 degrees the course. The people still want to Euro-integrate. They will still want to. We're so connected. We're so many programs. There's so many things going on the institutional level already that takes more than will of one person to just reverse it or to make a U-turn. However, if we have both pro-Russian president and then pro-Russian parliament, which is even more important I think, then we have a real problem. So yes, we have to concentrate on that. Yes, we make to make people think. We have to inform everybody. If you are more interested in the peculiarities of who's who, then I think we can direct you to some of our partners who deal with that directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mykhailo. Yeah. Do we have one question? If we have a few more minutes, then probably we can spend them on the questions from Washington and Brussels.
When I directed the questions to you, asking us questions here, I think if your audience in Kiev has questions of the panelists in Kiev too, I think we would welcome adding that to the mix.
There are no questions from the Kiev audience, so we can spend this time for the questions from Washington and Brussels.
Okay, great. Is there any other questions here? Okay, we have time probably to take one or two more questions. Is there anyone else in Washington? Okay, and next time we'll try to be more sophisticated to bring in the folks who are being live streamed to ensure we try to get some of their questions as well. So why don't we take this one question?
I'm Hatuna Khmichi. I represent IFES from HQ. I have a question. Are there any recommendations from donor organizations in terms of engagement? And what will be this recommendation and how donor organizations should change or what they should do in order to engage civil society more effectively?
Is there any other questions here? Okay, I think we have that one question. Back to you, Kiev.
Mm-hmm. Dennis, did you want to take the first question?
The question about whether any recommendation exists how civil society can move the reform, or probably I just did not understand properly.
Was the question about how to engage regular people in the civil society activities in their NGO?
The question is, how would you recommend donor organizations, whether European organization or USG organization, how they should engage more civil society and what are effective ways they should use in future up to elections or beyond elections to engage more effectively civil society, what they're not doing and they should be doing?
Well, my recommendation would be to focus more on the institutional support of civil society organizations rather than on the project-based support, because we don't know, we may not know how long international donors will be interested in funding Ukraine and what this engagement will be in the next years. We're grateful for the support we have, but we should not rely on the support only. So when the engagement of the international donors in Ukraine will decrease, or if it decreases, then civil society organizations should be prepared to function without that support. That's why now that the donors can choose what to fund and what not to fund, we believe that, like I said, it's important to focus on institutional funding that develops organizational capacities and makes them more resilient to the external challenges. Thank you.
I just have to agree with Olena very much, and that's my only comment. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Back to Washington now.
Thank you. I think we're getting close to the time allotted for this, and I think there's, I know I have about 50 questions in my head, and I hope one of the things through this too is the ability to link up with experts in Ukraine from here in Washington to Brussels, even after these conversations. And is to build this network and strengthen the network of those who are working on these issues in Washington and Europe and Canada and elsewhere. So this is not sort of the end, please. And we're always happy to hear, Orest, myself, and others. Many of you know key participants on the other side, and if there's anything that we missed or that we can do to improve the conversation, we want to know. But mainly, I want to thank those who made today's event possible on both sides, including John Alexander, my colleague, Adrian as well, who's also with the Friends of Ukraine Network, is the vice chair of our Civil Society and Democracy Task Force. I want to also, we'll talk a little bit more just about sort of next steps. I want to turn it over to Orest as well for just a final word, and then we'll turn it over both to Kiev as well.
No, I just want to join Jonathan in thanking you, especially the speakers, but also all the panelists and people who asked questions, especially Olena, Mykhailo, and Denis, for your really informative, substantive comments. And you provided us with a lot of food for thought, and more importantly, some action items, not only for our task force, but for the international community in general. And with that, I'll turn it back.
Yeah, and I second that as well. And we're going to get to these issues, and the people participating in Washington and Brussels are experts in their own right. So your contribution is critically important. And thank you for the presentations as well. And more important is just the visibility on this issue and communicating here in Washington over the next several months. We look forward to building on what we talked about. Olena, can I turn it over to you for a last word? And I know we've talked about the next 12 to 18 months and about we'll have our next event and focus next month as well. But turning it over to you for final words.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I would really like to reiterate our gratitude to the German Marshall Fund and to the US-Ukraine Foundation and to everyone who joined us today in Washington, Brussels, and Kiev. We are really grateful for all the Western support Ukraine receives, and we request you further political support for the reform process, and we're here to inform you on the key developments. We plan to hold these teleconferences on probably on a bi-monthly basis, and encourage you to join them. In the next few days, we will send out a follow-up note to inviting those of you who are interested to subscribe to our reform updates and to join an email directory for inquiries and for information exchange between the teleconference sessions. So thank you very much again, and we look forward to seeing you in our future events. Washington.
Thank you. And again, in Brussels as well, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to, and I don't know if you have anything you want to say in Brussels.
Thank you so very much for including us into this conversation, and we do hope that this trilateral initiative will go on.
Absolutely. Thank you again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again next month, but also to make certain that you sign up for these email updates. And I know coming from this, there's going to be a lot more written products. And I'm sure even hopefully we can influence and engage some of the election observers and others that will be going out over the next several months, and delegations and US officials, EU officials, Ukrainian officials, and others that we really want to participate, be partners with us in this process as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Olena, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Over and out.